Hello, welcome back to Marathon Man, where I go through Doctor Who from the very beginning, and you join me at a story which killed off the first two marathons I ever attempted. And even though I've done two successful ones since then, I still consider this story a bit of a hurdle. The first time I tried to do a Doctor Who marathon years ago, I couldn't make it past the Sensorites' second episode, The Unwilling Warriors. Then time after that, I couldn't make it past the Sensorites' fifth episode, Kidnap. The next time I did manage to make it through every single episode of Doctor Who then available, but I still sort of had a wobble at this story. The same was true on the next marathon. So what about this one? I've always therefore been conditioned to see this one as Season 1's stumbling block, and as such, something of a checkpoint. If I can make it past the Sensorites, it's relatively plain sailing for a while. See, the thing is, I always approach each marathon with an open mind, and I try my very best to forget what comes after the episode that I'm currently watching, and I try and stay in the moment. Last time, that had an unexpected result. Basically, it caused me to revise my previous opinions about the Sensorites. And while I didn't think it was as bad, it was still kind of bad. So did this viewing see a further jump up in my estimations? Barbara says rather dismissively that she's over that now, about the events of the previous story, which does feel kinda quick, until you remember that the cliffhanger for the previous episode did see enough time for them to change clothes, so maybe there's more time passed there than we think. But that aside, even though it does feel quite quick that Barbara has just immediately sort of moved on from the events of the Aztecs, you forget about that. I always think that this story starts quite strongly anyway. The first episode of the Sensorites is, I've always thought it's kind of great. The Doctor regaling his companions with a story of the time he threw a parson's nose back at Henry VIII is a great little scene. And it shows some of that lovely Doctor-esque cunning, considering it was a ruse to get thrown into the Tower of London anyway, which is where the TARDIS was. A delicious little vignette, which Hartnell is fantastic at performing. And it also has a lovely little link to Doctor Who's future. Not that it knew it at the time, because as we all know, the Doctor would one day go on to marry Henry VIII's daughter. The shot of the crew leaving the ship is great, and a creepy atmosphere pervades quite nicely with the assumed dead coming back to life. Ian and Barbara meet some people from Earth's 28th century and get a few spoilers about the fate of London, plus a nice mystery is set up. And there is a nice bit of business between the travellers when the Doctor announces that there isn't an ounce of curiosity in him.
I learned not to meddle in other people's affairs years ago. Now, don't be absurd. There's not an ounce of curiosity in me, my dear boy. Tell me, why are you in danger?
With the Sensorites' novel way of keeping the space travellers prisoner without actually attacking them, and the addition of mind control and the regular mentions of John and what may or may not have happened to him, they all combine to make for the most intriguing beginning to a serial that we've had so far. Incidentally, I think Stephen Dartnell as John is hugely effective, and quite a scary performance I would think for some children to watch. And the first cliffhanger is probably the best one we've had so far, with the Sensorite appearing at the window. So why did I ever struggle with this story again? After a very decent, if reduced in screen time showing in the Aztecs, Susan gets to prove herself as a vital and equal member of the crew when she realises that they can use their minds to fight back. In instances like this, where she's actually afforded something to do, I will continue to maintain that Susan is a really interesting character. A lot of the time, her being from another world kind of gets lost in her behaviour as an hysterical teenage Earth girl. But if you remind us of her alien nature and her intellect, and you stop infantilising her with a condescending view of teenage girls, lo and behold, she becomes an engaging character. Don't forget that in that first story, she's mercurial and interesting enough to drive the whole plot. The plot, which starts off Doctor Who as a whole. Once she's on her adventures and she starts twisting her ankle and she starts screaming at every little thing, she becomes diminished. So it's no wonder that Carol Ann Ford and some viewers have a kind of negative view of how Susan was treated. But that is to forget moments like this, where she is actually just as she has just as much agency as the other characters. Watching the episode set on the spaceship makes me grateful that the Enterprise didn't use the same sound effects for its doors, because that would have grated very, very quickly. But, much to my surprise, that really is the only complaint about these episodes that I have. They are paced in such a way that the eeriness is ramped up nicely, and the interactions between the characters are nicely crafted. The Doctor gets a heroic moment when he takes control of the ship, and a very satisfying comic beat when Maitland exclaims that John's hair is now white.
Did you know his hair was almost white?
There's nothing wrong with that.
And when he proclaims of the Sensorites, if they try to harm us, I will fight them, we see another glimpse of the hero that he's turning into. He's also forceful and authoritative in his first standoff with the Sensorites, but that's not to say that he has a monopoly on the strong character moments in this story, because for me, he is equally matched throughout by his granddaughter. When she agrees to go with the Sensorites, it cements these first 2 episodes, in my opinion, as Susan's strongest showing yet. By the end of The Unwilling Warriors, the episode that killed off the very first marathon I ever attempted, I was actually enjoying this story far more than I ever have done before. The next episode, Hidden Danger, starts well too. In just a few lines, the Sensorites end up a little sympathetic. "I'm frightened of them" is a lovely line to give one of them about our heroes, and Susan continues not to be shortchanged and gets an effective moment when she stands up to the Doctor.
What is all this, setting yourself against me,
I didn't, Grandfather.
Oh, I know you thought you were doing your best, child, in the circumstances, but I think I'm a better judge of that.
Well, I have opinions too.
More of this Susan, and I think she'll be more fondly remembered. By Carol Ann Ford too. In fact, the script is really strong up to this point. There's a lot of quotable lines and some strong relationships, and we've spent more than 2 episodes in the same set now, and it hasn't bored me. So why did I always think it did? What changed? When we move down to the Senseph, we naturally meet more Sensorites, and I think they're well realised. They're nicely drawn for an alien race, diplomatic yet with certain dissenters, and adding such shades of grey in their depiction differentiates them from, say, the Daleks and the Thals, and make them quite believable as a people. I also love how they refer to John as the creature John. It's utterly absurd to human ears, but at the same time very plausible that an alien race would use such terms. It's a nice touch. And there are plenty of those. Later on in this story, Susan will mimic a Sensorite running, and that really hit the spot for me. Big old grin on my face when she did that. I'm basically a Susan defender at this point. And at the moment Ian collapses, I realise this story has been 3 for 3 on cliffhangers. And strange though it is to say, I actually wanted to watch the 4th episode of the Sensorites. And A Race Against Death may be my favourite episode title of the marathon so far. I mean, as montages go, I think I prefer the one from Rocky IV to the Doctor just moving things from one test tube to another, but I think I'll give it a pass because I don't think montages as an art form were really perfected until the 80s anyway. After 4 episodes, I was still really enjoying this story, which hasn't actually properly happened before. I was surprised, but pleasantly so. So inevitably, I was almost crestfallen when things started to go downhill in the next episode, Kidnapped. Well, maybe I was just missing Barbara. Stephen Dartnell as John is still really watchable though, which I hadn't really ever noticed before. So even this episode that had killed off the second marathon I ever tried, I was still getting on a lot better with it because Stephen Dartnell gives a really good performance in this story, even when John starts to get his marbles back. And like, for example, shaking the hand of the Sensorite that cures him is just another one of those lovely moments that are peppered throughout this story, and there are more of those moments in the final 2 episodes than I remember there being. However, and it is a big however, even though it looked like it might not be the case this time, my patience is once again tested by the Sensorites, the story, not the aliens. Previously, it used to be the last 4 episodes that tested my patience enough to want to skip to the next serial. Last time, it was the last 2. This time, even though I found more to like in them, it's still those last 2. Okay, maybe next time I'll like it all consistently. There's a lot of stumbling over dialogue that happens in the latter half of the Sensorites, and it's really noticeable in those last 2 episodes. That said, probably the overall highlight of the story is nestled among them, when Susan, now firmly established in my mind as this story's MVP, gives her little speech on trust and then a description of her home planet, a description which is so good and Carol Ann Ford does so well. It was sort of resurrected when the Doctor describes Gallifrey to Martha in Gridlock. Give Susan more to do, please. Nevertheless, I still can't shake the feeling that A Desperate Venture feels as long as the previous 5 episodes combined. It's almost worth it for the Doctor's tender scene with Susan, where she talks of wanting to belong somewhere, though his outburst at Ian and threatening to drop them off at the next stop seems to come out of nowhere. I can't lie, when I said I was revising my opinions of this story, I have to confess that it is only slightly. Those final 2 episodes, and the final episode in particular, do knock off quite a lot of points for the whole, which is a shame because, as I said, I enjoyed those first 4 episodes more than I've ever remembered doing. Perhaps I remember more of the episodes being disappointing because Kidnap and A Desperate Venture feel so slow. But whatever the reason, this story could have been brilliant, but wasn't. I have definitely upped my rating of it though on this viewing. 36 episodes in, and as is always the case, my patience was tested for the first time on a marathon by the Sensorites. A change of setting will be really welcome. Without a doubt, it involves Susan. She is fantastic in this story, so I'm going to plump for 2. Her longing for her home planet, as she describes its burnt orange sky, is beautiful. And in episode 3, she gets a great character moment where she stands up to her grandfather. Episode 6, almost in its entirety. A friend of mine, hello Womble if you're watching, once pointed out that it's slightly too late to introduce the human villains at the end of this episode, when there'd be some mileage in exploring this idea of a mad society who's fighting an enemy that doesn't want to fight them. And I can't deny I had that in my mind when I was watching it this time round. Out of 5? I enjoyed it so much this time that the points getting knocked off by episodes 5 and definitely 6 can't quite drag it down to bad. So those first 4 episodes are still so good that it still scrapes a 3. As ever, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this jaunt to the Senseph, then you know how YouTube works. Please give it a thumbs up, it helps the channel out massively. And what do you think of the Sensorites? Is it a marathon killer for you too, or can you just not understand why it has that reputation? Do we agree on Susan? Do we disagree on the last 2 episodes? Let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you back here for the final story in Doctor Who's first season, where we will be guests of Madame Guillotine. And if you don't want to miss that, be sure to hit the subscribe button and clang that closer bell. I've been the Creature Chris, and I'll see you in France.